What's good, YouTube? It's me, Squid, back in another Squidio. Today I want to talk to you guys about how to beat the Unchained deck. This is one of the newer decks. Well, they've been around for a long time, but they actually got a lot of new powerful support in the recent Duelist Nexus expansion, and I know a lot of people are requesting this. The truth is, I don't really know how to beat this deck that well either. I've only played a handful of decks against them, but let me tell you, from that handful of games, at the beginning I thought this deck was absolute trash because they generally put up a mild, mid-rangey end board with only 2 or 3 cards in hand max, and for me I felt like, wow, this looks really weak. But after playing more and more games against them, I realized how consistent this deck is. It puts up the exact same end board every game, and it has insane recursion. Anytime these cards get destroyed, they get to add back cards, they get to summon back cards, they get to basically remake their entire board, and they are all floaters. It's actually really, really nuts, and a lot of the decks in the current metagame do rely on destruction for removal, so it can be very hard to get past this deck. Now, how this deck works is typically all of their monsters have effects when they're destroyed by a card effect or by battle. Actually, not even all their monsters, but all of their cards. In fact, their spells and trap cards, when they're destroyed by a card effect and sent to the graveyard, they have the effect where they can special summon an Unchained monster directly from their deck. So how this deck typically combos is going first, they'll set their Unchained spells or traps onto the table, and then from there they are able to proc the effect of a monster that they control or have in their hand, which typically has the effect to target a card they control and then pop it, thereby triggering the additional effect of the spell or trap card in the graveyard to special summon an Unchained monster from their deck as an extender, and they continue popping their cards to get off their plays. So how this deck typically works is they put up a seemingly innocuous end board of somewhere around 3 or 4 interrupts with about 2 cards in the hand. Typical end board revolves around something like an Unchained Soul of Rage, which is their generic link to, that happens to be an IP Masquerena for their opponent's monsters, so they can link off with your monsters during your turn. They also typically end on something called DDD Wave High King Caesar. Now, this is one of the more threatening interrupts in their deck. He's basically a Rukalos that negates any effects to special summon a monster, except he's not once per turn. So while he has 2 materials, he can use it up to twice per turn, which is really, really nutty. And on top of all of that, they typically have one of their traps or both set. So Escape of the Unchained, which allows them to target an Unchained monster they control and then a card on the field and pop them. And also the Chamber of the Unchained, which can special summon back an Unchained monster from the hand of the graveyard. And sometimes they also have the Abominable Unchained Soul either in their hand or their graveyard. When this card is special summoned, they can discard a card to non-targeting pop a card on the field. It's pretty nutty. And he can also proc his own effect to special summon from hand when a card is destroyed by card or by battle. So one of their cards, when it's popped, they can summon this from their hand. So if they do search it somewhere throughout their combo, it means they have a live, potentially non-targetable pop effect that can come out during any player's turn. And then the really annoying thing is that this deck is really consistent. They make the same board and they're able to make it over and over. They're able to recur a bunch of resources because they can pop their own cards. And every time their cards are popped, they also have the additional effect in the graveyard that targets a fiend monster in the grave to add it back to their hand, or to special summon it directly from the grave. So these guys all have insane recovery, and this deck is just really, really hard to deal with sometimes, especially if you're playing a deck that only has popping effects. And you might be thinking to yourself, why have we not seen Unchained in the past? Well, it's because in the Duelist Nexus, we actually got a bunch of crazy support for this archetype. It's actually nuts, like the insane support they got. Number 1 was Unchained Soul of Yama, which is a generic 2 fiend type monster linked to that allows them to add any Unchained monster from the deck to graveyard to hand, and also bring back a fiend monster when a fiend monster is destroyed. They also got 2 level 6 powerhouses in the form of Unchained Soul of Sharvera, which is a quick effect during the main phase. Target a fiend monster or a face down card they control, special summon this card from the hand, and when he's sent to the graveyard from anywhere, you can actually set 1 Unchained spell or trap directly from your deck. So this is one of the main reasons why it's good. You're able to set these traps instantly off of your deck now. Previously, you had to draw these cards, so it was always a neg. Like, you didn't want to draw traps, right? But now it's just an extension, a free set that you get off of Sharvera. And then there's also the Unchained Soul of Shyama, which is another level 6 that allows it to bring himself back from the graveyard by targeting a card they control and popping it. He can also use the effect to pop one of their cards to non-targeting, pop 1 spell or trap on the field as well. And then the fact that these guys are level 6 obviously opens access to the Wave High King Caesar, which happens to be a fiend because all of these guys do fiend lock you. So without further ado, let's talk about how to beat this deck. And starting at the top, Ash Blossom Joyous Spring. This is one of the best hand traps against this deck, especially because it's so commonly played and it's so good against every other deck. It's always playable. Well, you can actually use the effect of Ash Blossom in response to some of their traps or spells that proc in the graveyard. The thing that you guys have to know about Unchained is typically all of their combos revolve around having 2 cards minimum as their starters, right? Because they have to have 2 Fiend bodies onto the field to link off into the Unchained Soul Lord of Yama. And typically how they do that is they open a trap or a spell and they set that, and then they use the effect of either the Aruha in the hand to target it to pop, or the Shavara to target it to pop, or summoning a Rekia to targeting it to pop, and then using the effect of the graveyard to special summon a counterpart Fiend that they can then use to go into Shyama. The only one card that they have for a combo is actually Tour Guide from the Underworld, which allows you to instantly get 2 Fiend bodies onto the table for free. You can also summon something like a Fiendish Rhino Warrior, which allows you to Foolish a Fiend monster, so they're instantly able to access Shavara as well. But typically their combo is not going to revolve around Tour Guide because that's only a 3 of in the deck, so it's very hard to access to. So without that or Pot of Prosperity, they're typically going to be setting a trap and then using the effect of another Fiend monster to pop that and get the effect to get a Fiend body onto the board. So if we Ash in response to the effect of one of these traps or the Abomination Prison activating in grave, then that means they have to rely on having another Fiend extender to go off into their plays and then have access into the Unchained Soul Lord of Yama. So that's why I think you should definitely Ash the cards in the graveyard. Moving on is another powerful hand trap, NIBIRU the Primal Being. This is a sole gatekeeper of this deck, in my opinion, that's preventing it from achieving almost tier 0.5 status because NIBIRU hits his deck so hard. This deck has 0 Omni Negates. You can nib them just before they make the Wave High King Caesar, which would otherwise negate nib, but then that clears their board, and because their monsters are all hard once per turn, it means they're probably not going to be able to rebuild that board. So as long as you wait till they get to the point where they actually are going to make Wave High King Caesar and then NIBIRU them there, chances are you're probably going to win the game because this deck really struggles against NIBIRU, and having that 1-turn litmus where they barely have any interruption means that you're able to push for game or control the board in a way that they're not going to be able to come back. So definitely be siding or playing NIBIRU right now in the same way that it's decent against a lot of other decks in the metagame. I think NIBIRU is absolutely prime. Against this deck in particular, it's the best hand trap at the moment. If you're playing DROLL Lockbird, you should probably take him out because this card is absolutely horrendous against this deck. They barely do any adding, and when they do, it doesn't really matter. You're just going to be losing a card in their favor when you drop the DROLL, so it's definitely not something that we want to see against this deck at all. On the other hand, if you are playing D-Shifter, you already know this card is amazing against this deck as well because it banishes everything. They're not going to be able to get their Sharvaras in the graveyard. They're not going to be able to get their cards into the graveyard. However, they are still going to be able to use the effect to special summon from the banished zone when these cards are banished because they read, if the set card is destroyed by card effect, you can special summon an Unchained monster from your deck. It doesn't matter if it's in the graveyard, it can be destroyed and sent anywhere and trigger the effect basically. So that's just one thing to keep note of, is that they are still going to be able to play under Shifter, but their combos will be a lot weaker and their end board will be a lot weaker in terms of recovery because they're not going to be able to access their monsters in their graveyard to special summon back with Lord of Yama or to add back with their Link monsters like Unchained Soul of Rage or Unchained Soul of Anguish. So definitely would side this card in against them 100%. For Infinite Impermanence, Effect Veiler, and Ghost Mourner and Moonlit Chill. This is a little bit weird because these cards can really struggle against this deck. I've heard a lot of people say wait for them to summon the Lord of Yama before Veilering, but in my opinion, if they are normal summoning Tour Guide, I'm just going to use the Effect Veiler and the Impermanence right away on the Tour Guide. Now, the only caveat with this is if they happen to open the Unchained Soul of Sharvara, it can be awkward because this is a quick effect that targets a card they control to pop it. So what does that mean when we Veiler a Tour Guide and they have a Sharvara? Well, they can chain to pop their own Tour Guide, summon out the Sharvara, and then Tour Guide will resolve with effect. But I still think that it's worth the trade-off of them having the Sharvara, of them hard opening Tour Guide plus Sharvara into the Tour Guide, because Veiler and Imperm on Tour Guide could potentially mean that they even pass their turn if their hand is bad and they have no additional extenders. We just do not want them getting into the Lord of Yama, because even if we Veiler here on the Lord of Yama, they're still going to have this onto the table, which means that they have a lot of good recursion while this card is in the graveyard, and they could also chain the Sharvara anyways if you Veiler the Link monster, meaning they're able to get the search on top of having this monster in the graveyard, which has an additional effect. So in my opinion, there's no difference if you waited stated on the tour guide, it's still the same kind of nightmare scenario if they do have the Shavera already in their hand. But the nice thing about Veiling tour guide, and if they do have Shavera, they're wasting the Shavera on the tour guide instead of popping one of their spells or traps that they would have set later on in the turn. So this still does get a little bit of value in that case, on top of having the potential chance to blow them out of the water just stopping on tour guide, right? So that's my thought process on that. Obviously, Mourner is not going to work on tour guide, so you would probably hold that for the Lord of Yama instead. Another card that might have some decent application against this deck is actually DD Crow, because you can hit things that activate in the graveyard. So you can hit, for example, their Unchained Soul of Shyama, which means because they only play one copy of this card, they're not going to be able to access their Wave High King Caesar really easily, or at all potentially, if they do not have access to double Shavara, which is quite hard. And DD Crow actually has a lot of crossover against other popular decks in the format. There's things like Dragon Link against Pure Lily when they use Pure Lily to target a spell in the graveyard to rank up. You can hit Salamangreat. Like, there are a lot of graveyard reliant decks, and DD Crow happens to be the card that's always decently good. It's not a huge blowout, but it's something that could work against this deck if you are already playing it in your side deck. Another card akin to DD Crow that we've seen in previous formats is actually Skullmeister, and it's actually quite good against this deck because it serves as additional copies of Ash Blossom effectively. You're able to use this in response to any of their traps that trigger in the graveyard, special from deck, the spells as well. You can also use the effects that trigger in the graveyard when they try to special from deck, the effect of Shyama trying to bring itself back, the effects of Yama. I think Skullmeister is actually amazing against this deck, but the only issue with Skullmeister is that there are not a lot of crossover. There are barely any other decks in the format that actually activate in the graveyard, so Skullmeister doesn't really have too good of a bonus in that aspect. But the nice thing about Skullmeister is he's level 4, he's got 1700 body, he's a huge beefy hand trap, and he happens to be a fiend, so if you're playing a deck like Chimera, you can actually fuse with him. This is another card that I actually think is highly impactful in this metagame, but that's Phantasmay, and against this deck, there's no exception. You're able to draw 2 cards in response to them link summoning a Yama, putting back a potential brick or a second copy of a hand trap that we did not want to see in our hand, and then we get a 2400 body on the board in addition to potentially drawing closer and closer into other hand traps like Nibiru. And on top of all of that, the 2400 is quite threatening against Unchained Soul of Rage, which happens to target a face-up special summon monster that your opponent controls in order to link. So when they try to target something, we can use Phantasmay's effect to discard a card and negate and destroy that. Unfortunately, the 2400 attack does not threaten the 2800 attack Wave High King Caesar. That would have just been broken, but I think the application is still there. We're able to draw multiple cards, and Phantasmay is actually good against a plethora of decks in the metagame right now. Dragon Link, Salamangreat, there's so many different decks that are actually using Link monsters at this moment in time. In terms of the rogue deck strategies like the tier 2, tier 3 stuff, a lot of people are actually playing Link monsters. You can even use this against like some random Sky Striker player that you happen to play in the rounds of Swiss. So there are so many applications with this card. I think a lot of people have forgotten about it, but this card is absolutely threatening in Link formats. I've advocated for it a lot. I feel like this could be the format that we actually see this card being sided because of the fact that it's so darn good against Link decks. Moving on into board breakers, I actually think Cosmic Cyclone is effective, especially going first. We already went over the fact that they have to set a trap to the table and then use the effect of Shavara or Naruha to pop that set trap. Well, what happens is if you respond with a Cosmic Cyclone on that set card, it gets banished, and because cards like Aruha say that you have to destroy the targeted card, it says, and if you do special summon this card from your hand, that means that they're going to stay in your hand, so that Cosmic Cyclone will get double duty. You're stopping the effect to special summon from hand, and you're banishing that target that would have special summoned from their deck as well. This card is this highly effective going first against this deck. Going second, it loses a lot of value. It's still decently good because you can hit something like an Escape of the Unchained that happened to be set, because you generally know where it is if it's set off of Shavara. Otherwise, they can actually chain the escape and then pop one of their own cards, potentially triggering the effect in the graveyard of Yama to add some resources back to their hand. But at the end of the day, you're still getting rid of the escape of the Unchained, which would have popped something in our deck, right? So it would have popped like a Castira monster or something we want to keep on the field. So that's why Cosmic Cyclone does have some application going second, but it's very, very, very good going first, and it's way better going first in that matter. Talking about other cards, Evenly Matched is a card that's actually not that great against this deck. When you're staring down a board like that, they just You go to battle phase, they can chain the effect of Escape the Unchained and then pop their own Soul of Rage as well as another card they control, getting the effect to recur some resources back to their hand, and then they could keep the Wave High King Caesar onto the table that you still have to deal with. But if you think about it that way, you're still getting value out of the evenly matched. We're getting rid of the Escape of the Unchained and we're trading off the Soul of Rage, so it's still a 2-for-1, so it's decently good. I just find that in current metagame, now that the game has gotten faster and faster, the battle phase is just so relevant, especially when there's so many powerful battle phase related effects or game mechanics like Zeus, cards like Kashtira Fenrir that all trigger in the battle phase that we rely on top of swinging over things. So losing the battle phase feels kind of bad. Even if it is a 2-for-1, you have to do enough damage in your main phase 2 on top of them having a Wave High King Caesar and all these resources back in hand. You have to break through all of that and mount up a board that they can't crack through on their following turn while skipping your battle phase. So yeah, I'm a little not too sold on this card, but if you're already playing this card in your side deck and you have nothing better to play against Unchained, then you could definitely put it in just to take care of the end board that has the disruptions in the form of the Escape as well as the Unchained Soul of Rage. And then we get to our last couple of board breakers here, so Book of Eclipse and Book of Moon. I think these cards are decently good going second because of the sheer fact that they have Wave High King Caesar. There's basically every deck that special summons right now, so this card shuts down a lot of cards. And if you're not dealing with this card, if you're trying to go head on and tackle this card directly by burning through his double negates, you're probably not going to win. 2 negates is absolutely crazy in today's modern age of Yu-Gi-Oh! So having the book to flip down that big bad boy is absolutely imperative going second. And we have to, for the sheer fact of getting rid of this card, I think Book of Eclipse and Book of Moon are potentially good. But you could also get countered by a good Unchained player strategy because they can also pivot into Nightmare Griffin plays instead of making the Wave High King Caesar. Nightmare Griffin, for those of you guys that don't know, is actually a walking skill drain. Monsters cannot activate their effects unless they are linked, aka unless a link monster points to them, or if they're a link monster, they point to another monster. So when they have Nightmare Griffin on the table, it's basically skill drain, and books don't do anything against links, so they could potentially be dead in that aspect. You have to really see what the Unchained player is doing or capable of doing before siding these in for sure. But if your deck just can't deal with the Wave High King Caesar and it has a chance of dealing with a Griffin, then definitely side in the books. Unfortunately, the books are absolutely horrible going first against this deck because they can pop set cards they control and still get the effects. They don't care that you're booking their monsters, so definitely take these out of your deck going first. I would definitely not recommend having them in. So that's about all I had for the video. If you guys have any other tips on how we can actually beat this deck, because it's actually quite scary, let us know in the comments below. I would love to know before the YCS, because I think a lot of players will be playing this deck just because of how consistent it is. And I'm a little scared, to be honest. But other than that, we'll see you in the next video. Thanks for tuning in. Bye-bye.